You're listening to GameDive. On today's episode, we're going all the way back to 1998 to look at Rare's classic 3D platformer for the Nintendo 64, Banjo-Kazooie. We're going to be looking at the personality and charm that made this game so memorable, the failure states in the game, and talking all about the controls and the shortcomings presented by the N64. Stay tuned. So, on today's episode, we're talking about Banjo-Kazooie. I'm Perry, and joining me as always is Cam.
Good day.
And Evan.
Hey guys.
So it's definitely one of the most celebrated games to come out of the N64 era, I'd say. People have been talking about it literally ever since it came out. Although a lot of that discussion these days is mostly just when are we going to get a proper Banjo 3? Now, Cam, I know that, you've played this, you have more experience, I guess, with this game than Evan or I. So why don't you give us a little background on what the game is?
Sure, I'll try to sum this up for you. So, Banjo is an all-time recognizable game for pretty much anybody who was around the video game scene in the late '90s, early 2000s, or anybody who's interested in playing games of that era. The premise, in a nutshell, is that the neighborhood witch kidnaps your little sister Tootie, and she's trying to steal her youth so she looks like less of a hag. So now you got to venture into the witch's lair and rescue your sister before it's too late. So the majority of the game takes place within Gruntilda, who's the witch, inside of her castle. You're going around collecting puzzle pieces and music notes so you can progress further into the bowels of her castle, all the while going through really unique and colorful and interesting and vibrant worlds. Now, so much of the game feels unique despite it being kind of comparable to a lot of other games that came out in that time period. We've like there's DK64 and like Mario 64, for example, just two games that even came out on the same system. But what keeps Banjo from feeling like those games is its distinct sense of personality. Colorful environments, goofy animations, silly dialogues, and a mountain of a soundtrack really make Banjo's worlds feel distinct and memorable. And collectathon or no, this game is fun as hell.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And for someone who, personally I've never been a fan of collectathons, this game like 5 minutes in, I was pretty hooked. It was fun, and I was definitely engaged and eager to see what was going to come up next. So I think it deserves to still be talked about to this day.
Well, I think it's interesting. Some people don't like collectathons, but then, like you said, this one is able to grab you kind of immediately, and I think a big part of that is, like Cam mentioned, the kind of the charm and the quirk. All the funny, the goofy characters, the sound effects, even the soundtrack is, and it's all very fresh. Like nothing is really recycled between areas, so there's always something new around the corner, and I think that's what keeps it fresh and interesting.
I think it also does a good job of not bogging the player down very early within the game. I mean, when you start off right away, bottles can give you a bit of a tutorial about, what your moves do, and you only start off with so many moves, which I kind of like. You kind of have, your basic run, jumps, and doing whatever, but the most of the more complex moves that make the game more difficult or interesting come later on in the game. So right when you start off, you can kind of just go and do whatever, and it doesn't like bog you down with endless tutorials or like a different tutorial world, and then it puts you into the game. It's just you're into the game right away. It just releases you into it.
Well, I think in that sense, one thing it does well that even to this day people are complaining that games don't do is it gives you that option at the beginning with what's his name? Goggles,
Bottles.
bubbles, bottles. Yeah, that's the one. He's in Trailer Park Boys, right?
Yeah.
Um yeah, no, he says like, do you need this tutorial or are you good to go? Which I think is really good considering, for a more arcadey game, people might want to replay it or, for whatever reason and not want to deal with a tutorial again. I mean, personally, I'd never played it, so I went with it and it was actually enjoyable even for a tutorial and genuinely just because of the writing.
Yeah, well, you know what? Speaking of the writing, and this is only like the surface level of the true charm of this game, but if you say no to the tutorial and then you go back to Bottles, he's like, "No, you said you didn't need it. What do you bet? Go on, show me what you got."
You tough guy now, huh? I don't need
Hmm.
tutorials.
And
It's
it's that
interesting
kind
for
of
sure.
dialogue that really it makes it kind of unique for like a Nintendo game back then. I mean, a lot of games had dialogue in a way, but not a lot of them were kind of quippy like the dialogue in this game is.
Yeah, there's a weird, almost like a tongue-in-cheek kind of tone to the whole thing, and almost more mature humor in a way. Obviously it's not overt like sexual references or
I
anything like
mean,
that, but
Gruntilda does say striptease at one point at the end there as an option of what she does at a party, so I'm
oh,
not
that's
so sure
questionable.
about that one.
Okay, that's a little questionable. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part of why we can even enjoy it now. We're 20 somethings, but they're still written with that kind of sort of more mature tone. It's like Shrek, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Banjo is Shrek.
In
I mean, they're
conclusion,
both good. All right, I'm gonna run with that.
No, I think you're right though that the writing isn't typical of that era, I don't think, at least not on like the N64 and consoles at the time where, writing was either very, family friendly and you don't really have to think about it all too much, or it was just blatantly information that's being
Yeah,
passed on.
well, a lot of the time it seems like they tried to keep it to a minimum, right? And I
Yeah.
guess the thought process is, most of the time what you want to be doing when you're playing a game is not reading. But that's not necessarily true. So you make the reading interesting. Like Gruntilla, for example, rhymes everything she says.
Speaking of Gruntilda, throughout the time you're in her castle in the hub world, and you spend a decent amount of time in there going between levels, she'll constantly just sort of being poking and prodding at you, teasing you. And I think it's really interesting because a lot of the times in games, you'll sort of, you'll get the quest right near the beginning, and then there'll just be like 10 hours of you just, doing stuff. And then in the end, you get to the goal and you're like, oh, yeah, this is why I was doing all this. But in Banjo, it's like she's constantly there reminding you, teasing you, like keeping her in mind that this is what the end goal is. And I think that's really interesting. It's uncommon in a lot of games to have the final boss be just prodding at you throughout the game.
well, and another thing they do actually, which love it or hate it, every time you quit the game, it gives you the game over screen, showing Gruntilda's victory, which actually I think serves to do kind of the same thing that you're describing here.
Yeah, that one gave me
Where,
a bit of a heart attack the first time I quit. Like, wait, no,
yeah,
what was I supposed to do the whole game? Did
yeah,
I
you
just
got to finish
lose?
the whole thing in one sitting. But yeah, it is a good way of keeping it in your mind for sure.
Yeah, even that though, you mentioned that it's interesting that they do that, and I actually strongly agree because it breaks the fourth wall pretty majorly, where it's like, this is the game. If you quit, then you've given up. So I think it's a nice change that they are so playful with the seriousness of the game.
Yeah, and I mean, we're talking about how great the like dialogue writing of it is, but the story of the game is very really quite simple and not anything crazy. But I think that that's totally fine for what this game needed to do. We didn't need a very complex, overarching narrative to drive this home.
Yeah, no, I mean, just enough to get the gameplay going, give the player a reason to be doing any of this, and it would have been fine. But I think they went above and beyond and just absolutely were having fun with it when they came up with all that.
Absolutely.
It is really quite actually amazing how enticing the story, if you will, is in this game. Because, like you say, it's hardly even a purpose from get to point A to point B, right? Sure, the a witch has your sister, but I mean, like nothing else in the entirety of the game happens in terms of plot. It is literally just you like running through a series of hoops and Gruntilda yelling at you. and yet somehow that feels like it's enough. It somehow feels like that is enough of like a plot or a story to get through. Or maybe it's not that it feels like it's enough of a plot or the story. It's just the game itself is so inviting, you don't even think about it.
Well, yeah, gives the player enough of a reason. It's fairly uh, core and simple at its you know most basic. You want to save your sister, so you're gonna go do this stuff. But I think the trick is that they do keep it at the surface the whole time by her constantly chiming in, by the end game screen if you quit. It's not just she says it at the beginning and then you confront her at the end and don't care in the middle. It's constantly reminding you. And I think that is why it's so effective with such a simple plot, if you will.
Well, not only that, but each of the worlds in the game kind of has its own micro story for you to kind of follow along with. So, like in Freezeezy Peak, there's like the bear children, and you gotta go find their dad and, have
And their
wacky adventures with
neglectful
him.
father, yeah.
Yeah, and, like the tree and the camel in the desert level. There's kind of mini stories going on for you to kind of follow, and you're never going to just an empty level just to collect stuff, and I think that's a big part of what makes it so inviting, so as you say.
Yeah, I definitely agree that the hub world gives plenty of time to remind you of what the overarching plot and drive is for the game. But yeah, no, absolutely. In each world itself or each level, it gives it its own micro plot of what you're doing or reasons to do stuff or just stuff to keep it interesting, honestly.
I think a big part of that is that the levels aren't massively expansive. Like some of the levels feel like there's a lot of stuff and a lot of content within them, but then when you really when you jump up on a vista and you look around, you see that the map's not very big at all. And yet somehow it always feels like there's so much to do and so much to explore within that confined area. And I think that makes a really effective and fun experience because it's dense. It's dense with like narrative, gameplay, and things to find. And you're not like searching. Well, obviously, when you get towards the end of the level and you're trying to complete it and get all the jiggies, you're searching for the last couple of secrets. But for the first time you step into the level, no matter where you go, it always feels like you're going to find something. And it never feels like you're wasting your time going down a path.
Yeah, I think this is actually probably my single favorite thing about this game is the size of the levels, because I always was thinking, kind of comparing them to levels in Mario 64, which quite often can be kind of maze-like, large, confusing, and less focused. But with this game, it feels like all the good stuff is closer, and as you say, it doesn't waste as much or any of your time really.
Hella fun, hella concise.
Definitely agree that the level design in this game in Banjo is fairly dense. It packs a lot of stuff into the area, so you're not just moving from point A to point B a lot of the time. But at the same time, I found personally, at least, that it was very I don't know, like it was messy. Where I'm not sure if you two had the same issue. I don't think you did, but for me, it was just I couldn't create a model of the level in my mind where it was like, okay, this landmark is here, and then to get to this landmark, I have to go through here. I always found that I don't know if it was a texture thing where the level would just kind of blend together in my head or a layout thing for me, but through basically every single world, I had issues plotting the world in my head.
That's a tough one for me. Obviously, I've played this game a lot, so I mean, coming back and playing it now, I generally know where everything is, like right off the hop, right when I get into the level. But it just sounds like you didn't take a second to really just like stop and look around the level. Because if you were to find like some shots of the level with the camera removed from behind Banjo, you can really see how simplistic some of the actual designs are.
I
But
mean,
I can
that's true.
understand what you
That
mean about how like maybe it can become difficult to kind of orient yourself on certain maps. So like Bubble Gloop Swamp, for example, like if you're, always cognizant of not trying to fall into the swamp water and, you know, you get a little bit turned around here and there because some of the
this
swamps look the
this was
same.
me.
But I mean, if you were to again, if you were to get like a top-down view of just the entire map, you'll see that it's
Yeah, it's
just
like
like
four
three quadrants.
quadrants.
Yeah,
Yeah. Was it 3?
Well, I think it's worth mentioning that most of the levels that I can think of, if not all of them, have high up vantage points that you can reach that kind of show you the entire level almost from top down. Like in the Pirate's Cove
Assassin's
level, you
Creed.
can go up to the lighthouse. Yeah, you hit Y to synchronize with Banjo and the Animus. But I found that was a good way of letting you kind of see the entire level and getting acquainted
That's
with it.
true, but by the point that you're actually at those high vantage points in the level, you're usually at least halfway through. You know, they're not the first or near to the first things you'll do in a level. And I think that brings up an issue with that I had with it was the camera itself. Is that yeah, you know, if you're able to get a better sense of your surroundings as you're moving through it and get a better vantage of stuff, you know, better angles on things, maybe that's true. You would be able to sort of create a better map in your brain of where everything is. But for me, I found myself fighting so often with the camera just to move where I want to move. And this may just have been an issue with N64 because I know this game was also ported to Xbox when Rare was acquired by Microsoft. But for
It
me, it
definitely
was,
is a 64 problem.
yeah, it was a
Having
constant
a C
issue.
stick to control the camera on the Xbox is so amazing. It's just so much better.
Yeah, no, it's like you're fighting with do you let it do its own thing? Do you move it in set amounts using the C buttons? Do you try and, you know, just stay behind you holding the shoulder button? And none of it often gave you a really good view of what you're trying to do, or even aside from that, the whole surroundings that you have nearby. You know, it's usually just, I really need to walk through this narrow path. What of these 10 different camera options will keep me from just running off the side?
Well, I'm not going to tell you that the camera in the N64 version it doesn't have problems, but I at least found I didn't struggle with it too much. I found that the shoulder button, I think the R button, just to center the camera behind Banjo, was for the most part good enough. There are a few segments where they have a fixed camera that's kind of ambiguous and you can't
And more than a few. That
adjust it.
happens quite a bit. The
Yeah,
fixed
but
camera.
yeah, sure.
It goes back and
And I
forth.
mean, in terms of not being able to see the level layout until you're about halfway through, I think that's actually pretty solid way to do it. You don't want to just walk into the level and immediately be able to see the whole thing and see everywhere you need to go. There
Yeah.
needs to be some amount of exploration.
Absolutely. But my argument there was just that even, you know, I didn't necessarily even by the end of the level have a good sense of the layout. But Cam's point was that there was usually high vantage points there that give you you know, the ability to see the whole level in one overall view. But my issue is just even regardless of that, from the beginning, I had trouble building this level out in my mind. And it was either partially because textures are fairly busy and a lot of stuff gets sort of mixed together for me, or the layouts themselves were fairly busy. And that might just be a consequence of having such dense level design.
Mm. Yeah, it's kind of like in Mumbo's mountain, for example. Like, is Mumbo on the mountain? Is he not on the mountain? I mean, like it says he's on the mountain, but I mean, is he? It can be difficult sometimes.
Game breaking. No, I think my the biggest offender for me in that regard was probably Freezy or yeah, Freezy Peak. You know,
That's right.
yeah. So it's you know, it's a fairly simple thing when you take a second to think about it. It's a central point with a few surrounding branches you can move up and down. But for me, it was just everything looked so similar. You know, models for the terrain are very flat. You know, regardless of the uh, incline or not, they're very flat models. You know, they're not very distinct in and of themselves, and then the textures as well are very samey a lot of the time. You know, and there's definitely really charming stuff, but for me, just that those focal points in a level that let me align myself to where I am in the space were very hard to come by in that one. And
Hmm.
then it was a problem for me in more than that level, but I think that one for me was the sort of epitome of the issue I had with it.
I feel like part of that could be remedied if you got better camera controls while you're flying around. And you think that flying around is like an amazing way to kind of see everything
Oh,
and get the
yeah.
lay of the land, but it's kind of hard to see what's directly in front of you or just slightly below you when you're flying.
Or below you at all. I mean, often that flying, you're required to dive to hit something, and you just, you have to, to let Jesus take the flight at that point and hope you hit what you're going for because you have no way to look down while you're flying.
Not only that, but there's no indicator of where you're actually aiming. Like there's no way to tell when you hit that button where you're gonna fly with that missile attack.
Yeah, that seems like a issue of that era of game design, and just crosshairs are, oftentimes in games. I think GoldenEye, the Zelda series, Banjo, there just isn't crosshairs. You just have to assume and learn over time the general spacing of where you're aiming.
Yeah, and I mean this is also ties into a pretty big point about how, at least in the N64 version of the game, the controls are often pretty abysmal, even
I mean,
just
they're the
outside of
hardest
flying.
part.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, at least in my experience, a lot of that comes from the kind of poor frame rate that you get a lot often in the N64, and also in the N64's actual joystick, the physical stick that you move with your thumb. I hate that thing. It's just, it
Yeah,
feels so unwieldy.
I've definitely had less of a problem with the N64's physical controls in general than you have, but I agree that, I mean, most of the issues I have with the game do come from just the ability to control it inherently are kind of janky, if you will. And I'm not sure about you can, but I think that they probably remedied that to an extent in the Xbox port.
It does kind of just feel better. And I mean, definitely because you're off the janky N64 controller stick. I'm with Perry. I think that thing sucks. I like, really like, even when you want to talk about games that have like supposedly tight controls, like Mario 64, it's like, sure, it's tight, but the stick is still jank. Mario goes where you tell him to, but you only tell him to go in like 8 fucking directions.
Yeah, maybe this is just more of an I grew up with it thing and I'm used to it by now, but
Yeah, you're just a nostalgia bum.
yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, for me, this game seems to acknowledge the difficulty of the controls by actually building a lot of puzzles and obstacles around the fact that the camera is difficult to control or just uncontrollable at certain points, and the actual motor control of the character is difficult because of the joystick or whatever.
You got
There's,
to make the games difficult somehow, right?
I mean, yeah, but a lot of the time it's not through clever puzzle design, it's through, we know that it's hard to move the character around precisely, so we're going to make this really narrow twisting path above a surface that will instantly damage you and damage you until you get out of it. And I'm talking to you, Bubble Gloop Swamp. It's
I mean,
it's
that's pretty standard
frustrating,
fare for a platformer, though. Like,
but it's really
narrow
frustrating.
pathways to walk across, and even in N64 era, like even in Mario 64. And actually, Banjo Kazooie, it came out 2 years after Mario 64. Seems to have, I guess, taken some lessons from that one. And the platforming in this game is actually turned down quite a lot. There's really not that there isn't any. There's certainly some difficult platforming segments in this game, but it's really not the focus. It's really been shifted to just the exploration and the, looking for puzzles and secrets.
Well, and that's what gets me is that there is this huge focus on exploration and discovering areas and little hidey holes where jiggies or jinjos or notes or any of the collectibles are hidden. And then it's just, okay, now I hope you've been working on your motor control skills because you have to hop up this leaf platform that is tiny and growing smaller in the case of Click Clock Woods at the end there, where depending on the season you're in, the platforms actually get smaller and smaller and smaller, which, to be fair, this is the technically last level. So hopefully by then you've been training well enough that you can do this. But again, even just Bubble Loop Swamp, it's narrow passages with obtuse camera controls, and the movement is relative to the camera, so you got to work with that to get past these obstacles, and it's frustrating more than challenging for me at least.
Yeah. I mean, it's a shame that like the phrase "get good" like wasn't invented back in '98, but I feel like this could be applied very accurately here. There
Yeah.
are sometimes look. The one thing I will say is when you are like wandering around past the ledge and then the camera suddenly like jerks and then it throws you off the ledge because the camera changed and then your reference changes. That's absolutely unexcusable. But like times where you're just trying to walk across a tight pathway. I mean, that's just what games s.
Well, that is the challenge of the scenario. Yeah.
Well, but that's my point, is that they've designed the obstacle around the clear uh struggle that the camera controls and or movement controls uh give. you know there's often times where you can't get a perfect
Wait, hold on. Let
six
me. I
o'clock
want to take a
camera.
step back. Like what? Like how do they know this? These are bad controls. They're just like, oh yeah, this N64 controller it doesn't do controls very well, does it?
Well, no,
Nah.
at
Like
the
what is better than the
time.
N64 controller when this game came out? Like
No,
what is
absolutely.
good controls that people are designing around? Is like did they get just shoddy N64 controllers and program that into the game somehow?
No, you're right. At the time, this is peak gameplay over here. This is maximum processing power, and that's what they were working with. But I think my point is that they did build it around the controls that existed at the time. And I
I
guess
think it's
retrospectively, you're
wrong
able.
to look at it from the perspective of them understanding the controls are subpar, and more to look at it that that's how they were just designing the game at the time. That's how they thought the game should be designed at the time, because 3D games, like 3D spaces, were still kind of a new thing around then.
That's true. And I mean, I've played less Mario 64 than maybe you have. I've only played little bits at a time, but in that, I think the camera is actually really well done, where it often gives you a very large uh, FOV of the space you're in, and in the little bits that I've played of that one, I never found myself very frustrated with the controls where I did in this. So I'm not sure what necessarily it was that might have made that different, aside from how the camera controls in this game related to the movement controls.
Off the top of my head, Mario 64, like there are some points where you need to be like precise with your landing locations, but it doesn't feel like as much compared to Banjo, where there's a lot of like small ledges that they ask you to jump onto.
Yeah, and with harsh penalties if you miss.
Yeah.
Often, but one thing I'd like to highlight that Banjo does to kind of remedy this is with the double jump in the game. It's both a double jump and a glide effectively, which kind of allows you to micro manage your spacing as you're kind of landing. That and the backflip jump kind of has a gliding kind of effect to it, a gliding movement to it, which I think allows you to control it a little better.
Yeah, I think that the abilities you have to work with in the game are definitely you have more to work with in general than you do in Mario 64 in terms of platforming. But even then, I felt like it was very slidey a lot of the time when you do land, or in the air. It's you might have time to adjust due to the gliding effect, but even then, oftentimes you don't necessarily. Like it might give you a few frames to save yourself if you're about to fall off something, but even then, I never found myself really relieved. Like, oh, I nearly died or nearly fell, and that saved me. A few times, yes, but most of the time, the momentum my character had in general was too much, or I just missed it too hard to save it.
Well, that's something you have to get better at as you play the game, no?
Get good as
Is
you will, but
understanding how your character moves and how you need to interact with the game to move them better, right?
yeah, that's true. I guess the thing is when you aren't very good at it, it feels very not good.
The one thing I will say that you're kind of right on is the like banjo, even outside of freeze easy peak, will sometimes kind of slide around when you come down from jumps and things like that. And I don't know. I understand that's a control scheme that exists in a lot of games of this date, but I don't like it, especially in games like Sonic and stuff like that. I feel like I want Banjo. It's okay for me, but games like Sonic, whatever, I want that jump arc in that. I don't want any slide out there. I want the controls to be as precise as possible. With Banjo, it's kind of okay. In most situations, it doesn't really bug you that badly, but I will say that I don't like sliding around.
Yeah, I think in Banjo in particular, it was probably done to make the oh, what's that trot move called again? Clip clop
Talon Trot.
trot, Talon trot. Yeah, that's the one. Talon trot to feel more precise, and that's the whole idea of it. Kazooie is gripping into the ground with his talons or her talons, and that's it's giving reason for why you can do a lot of things you can in the game with that ability in the first place. It's saying, okay, this is why you can move up high inclines, and this is why you don't slide around, is because she's gripping the ground more than Banjo is. And they
Clever enough.
seem, yeah, and it seems like, to make that feel more so, they made Banjo a bit slipperier.
Yeah.
But I think for me at least, it feels worse in a bad way. Obviously you can make it so, yeah, feels like you've maybe a bit less precise traction, but a lot of the time it feels like you just have very little traction compared to Kazooie when you're moving as Banjo.
The other trade-off when you're using Talon Trot is the constant noise and wooing of Kazooie every time you jump.
Yeah,
As
maybe
much as
that's how
like
they were trying to dissuade you from using it constantly.
this game's got amazing sound effects and sound design, but man, that is the one that you said something to me actually when you were playing this. Somebody else that was in the room while you were playing, it was like, "What the hell are you
Yeah,
playing? What is all these noises?" It never really
yeah.
occurred to me because I always play by myself. But I feel like if I were to take a step back and just have to ambiently hear somebody playing Banjo Kazooie, that would be so obnoxious.
Well, I could
Yeah.
speak from firsthand experience because I was in the room when Evan was playing a bit, and I heard like these noises going off, and I was like, what on earth? Like I've played the game, but I'm like, what on earth is this? And it's just the noise of him picking up like 6 or 7 eggs in a row. It just each one makes the same jingle, and it's pretty obnoxious.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, you have
no.
no idea how obnoxious it is until you're not immersed within the game itself.
Yeah, when you're not the one doing everything, it makes you want to destroy the game itself. Like I was playing quite frequently through my playthrough with my girlfriend in the room, and it's she was very supportive. Yeah, she wants me to do this, and she enjoys that I enjoy it. But after an hour of hearing incessant music and sound effects and jingles that are all the same, constantly playing with slight variation, she wanted to leave the room. I mean, and even myself, after an extended playtime, even I get sick of it at a certain point where it's, the same high strung, quick tempo stuff that's just nonstop. And I'm like, I need to be on Adderall to play this without noticing.
Yeah, it feels like something's got to give, right?
Yeah.
Parents in 1998 had it rough.
Yeah, so everyone who has been alive for 30 years, go thank your parents for not throwing your N64 out the window.
Yeah, which is a shame that it's so, I guess, obnoxious to other people and sometimes even the people playing it, because the sound effects are such a big part of what gives this game so much of its color and personality. Like every character has kind of a funny mumbling voice that's unique to them, and every item you pick up has a kind of little satisfying jingle to it, and obviously each level has its own music track that kind of sets the tone.
Yeah, but it's also is like a variation of like the regular theme, which I think is really cool.
No, you're right. I think overall the game has very appealing sound design and musical choices that they've done. I think that restraint would have been a benefit to the overall experience. Give me some silence every now and then. Give me some
Maybe they were
low-key
expecting
tracks.
people to game their game just 3-4 hours in a row.
Yeah, so I think it isolated sound design is very good. I think in practice for extended playtimes, it gets annoying to be honest.
I want to talk about some of the things that they do in the level that's really clever. Is like when you're at different altitudes, the tone of the song and the level changes. If you're underwater, it changes. If you're in a hallway or like underground or something, it changes, and it's still that same melody, but it just takes on a different life. It sounds like, well, when you're underwater, it kind of sounds like you're underwater. Like if you've ever heard kind of things ambiently through water, it really gives it a really cool effect. And it's, well, one of the bonuses of having the sound design so front and center of the game is that all those things are very noticeable. They're not very noticeable as they, kick you in your head, but like as soon as you go into a different part of the level and the tone changes of the music, you kind of understand exactly what changed and where you are.
I mean, you're right. It's definitely pleasant that the underwater music is enjoyable because otherwise, being underwater in that game made me want to off myself. Yeah, the underwater in Banjo-Kazooie is probably the least enjoyable thing I've played in the last year.
Well,
It
when has being underwater in any N64 game been a good time?
Majora's Mask as a
Yeah, I was just gonna
Zora.
say that's the
Eh.
only thing I can think of.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's the only thing, but someone got it right,
Yeah.
and Banjo got it very, 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 very. Pink. It's inverted, camera relative, and like blunt. Turning is not tight, movement is not precise.
Movement is either
All
way too fast or way too slow.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Or not moving
probably
at all.
no out of as melodramatic as this is. I think it is the worst underwater control scheme I have played in a game, with Skyward Sword being a close second place here. But it is terrible, and it made levels like Clanker's Cavern and Rusty Bucket Bay absolutely miserable for some parts. And in the case of Clanker's Cavern, for a lot of the level, it felt absolutely grating
I just have
because
to
you
get
have to be
used to it.
underwater. Well, yeah, if I had to walk with one leg, I would get used to it over time. But
I
it's
think again
not the optimal way.
I think the worst part about being underwater is just like a lack of depth perception. Like trying to pick up.
Absolutely.
You can think of Clanker's Cavern when he had to go down and kind of release his bind so he can kind of float above the
Oh,
water a bit.
absolutely, yeah.
It's really difficult just to pick up those water notes or to pick up the air bubbles that the fish leaves behind, because
Yeah.
it's very difficult to tell where the hell the depth is.
No, I never drowned in that part, but you're right. Depth perception in an entirely 3D space in the game is difficult when you don't have a ground.
Mm.
And I
They do
think
a little bit where they try to give you a shadow, but that's all you
yeah,
get.
when you can see the ground. But
Mm.
I think the thing is the same problem exists in the flying mechanics where depth perception is fairly difficult. But at least in that you have fairly tight controls relative to the swimming controls.
Yeah, they're
So
very
it
much more
doesn't
responsive.
feel yeah, it doesn't feel as bad as the swimming.
I'm gonna just kind of say here. I think that it's safe to say the controls in the N64 version of the game have aged pretty poorly, and yeah, I don't think there's much else to say there.
Yeah. No, I definitely in terms of obstacles was never more frustrated by a puzzle than by the actual controls themselves.
Well, I want to move on and talk about something that I think was a little weak in this game. And so, this is a collectathon, right? This is a game where you have to go around, collect a bunch of things in order to progress the game. And the requirements are actually quite high by the end of the game. You need to get 94 out of 100 jiggies and like 820-ish, I don't recall the exact number, music notes out of 900 in order to get to the very ending, which is not a problem in itself. The problem is, for me, the kind of impermanence that each of the world states has. And what I mean by that is when you die in a level, any level in the game, it usually means that you're losing all your progress towards collectibles except for any jiggies that you've already acquired. So all the music notes, all the Jinjos, and like if you die or if you even leave the level, you just lose all that progress, which can be frustrating when you have to backtrack to these levels to pick up a few jiggies or music notes here and there to continue on.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the first time I died in a level, and I think it was still just the oh, what was it? I think it was Treasure Trove Cove, and I lost everything but the jiggies. I was like, hold on, wait, what? No, 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 no. Like I just spent an hour getting all those, and you tell me I have to do it again?
Well,
And
look, I'm okay with the Jinjos resetting. I like, if you don't get all five of them, like that's the challenge, right? You got to get all five of them without dying. I'm okay with that.
sure,
That's the
yeah,
challenge. But what I don't like is that even once you've gotten all five of them, even once you've gotten all 100 music notes, if you return to the level, they respawn. They're all still there. And there's no way to check what jiggies you have in a level, like which ones you've gotten already. So I went back and recollected the same Jinjos I'd already gotten because I didn't realize that I'd already gotten. And I mean, it's just a matter of kind of creating some unnecessary confusion there.
Yeah, they
yeah.
definitely did a good job in remedying that in the Xbox version. Because yeah, not
How'd they
having to
change it?
go back. Music notes are permanent.
What?
Oh, really?
What?
Yeah, or
Yeah,
at
see, that'd
least
be good.
yeah, like I'm pretty sure I've even stepped outside of levels and come back in. And like I'm not totally sure about that one, but I know you can. I know for a fact that you can die and you'll still keep all your. I don't know
Okay,
if you
well,
can get a game
for a
over, but I
guy
know you
who
can
plays
die.
everything on nightmare absolute freaking masochist difficulty, I don't think it's fair that you played this
I
on
get the
Xbox.
nice and easy one. No,
Like
man.
that's
If the 64 controller is that good, I mean, why won't you play that version?
well, no, I think that's the most absolutely frustrating aspects is that if you die, if you have to leave the level, or even if you accidentally leave the level, as I did a few times near the beginning of my playthrough, you lose all of your progress save for the jiggies you found already. And I, thinking about it after I played, I thought that one solution might be that what they could have done is tie that to total lives. So, there's a lives meter in this game. Oftentimes I doubt that many people got to 0 lives outside of quitting the game. And I think one way they could have made that feel better in terms of losing progress in a certain level is by tying the total loss of progress to total loss of lives, like getting that game over. Because
Hmm.
otherwise, it almost feels like the lives have no meaning. It's like, why am I collecting these? I'm not going to lose 5 lives by the time I quit this game by the end of this play session.
Yeah, when I
And
first started up, I got through like the first couple of levels and I had 9 lives, and then I shut it down, went to bed, came back another time, and then I was back to 3. It's like, well, what was even the
yeah,
point of that? I mean,
it
obviously, I'm
seems like,
more seasoned in the game than I guess a new person would be,
well,
but
I was new and I've never had that issue of losing all of my lives.
hmm
I was in the same boat there.
yeah. So they did make the proper fix was just to not, you know, just don't do that.
Yeah, I mean, I can also chime in and just say that the only time that, like, I only ran out of lives once, and that was on the game show, but before that, not at all.
Yeah, so I think that a way they could have made both systems feel better was by tying that loss of progress in terms of notes, Jinjos, maybe, and anything else aside from Jiggies attached to your total lives and make lives harder to come by. Because, if you're getting 9 lives by the time you're 3 worlds in and there's no risk of losing all of them, which I think most people who have any experience with gaming will probably manage to do. I think that, what's the point of the lives otherwise?
Yeah, absolutely. The lives are pretty much useless at this point. When you run out, all that happens is you just get sent back to the start of Gruntilda's lair, which is the same thing that happens when you turn the game off.
Yeah. And then
So,
the fatal state of losing all your health in a level is almost more severe than that.
yeah, that's true. Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion. I think that would kind of tie those two kind of subpar features together in a nice way.
So, in terms of the jiggies, then, the end game state, like you were saying earlier, you need 94 out of 100 to even complete the game. And Uh, what else? You need, I think the total is like 850-ish notes to be able to pass all the barriers to get to that point. It's fairly high, and
Absolutely.
there's nothing that tells you until that point, which adds to the playtime available for better or worse of the game. Uh, but I personally would try in each world to get all 10 jiggies and 100 notes. And the only time I didn't was in Gobi's Desert, where I got absolutely frustrated and just left. But imagine that happens more and more as the game moves or progresses and the levels or the worlds become more difficult. And then you get to, okay, I've managed to get through as much of this game as I can. I've gotten to the final boss, and it's like, ha, joke's on you. Go back and collect 20 more jiggies or 120 more
That
notes.
is somewhat what happened to me. I mean, I wasn't playing quite as completionist as you were. I was doing maybe 7 or 8 jiggies per level, or as many as I could find within without having to scour every inch of the level, and that was pretty good for the most part. I got like all the way through to the game show, like the first ending of the game, if you will,
Mm,
the first credits, and then I'm like, oh great, there's more, cool. So I'll go up, fight Gruntilda, and then you get up there and it's like, psych, you need like most of the jiggies, most of the music notes. So I was a little deflated when I saw that because I was excited to
yeah.
just beat the game. Um, but I don't think it was that bad, truly.
Yeah, I think maybe a bit more grace on that. Even if it increased the jiggy count a bit more. So maybe, you need a 94 out of 115 or something.
Or they
Where
even could
then,
have paced it a little closer, like you need more and more as the game goes on, like closer to the amount, like the 100.
true.
Because for
Because, yeah,
me
I
that
mean,
was like quite a shock to see like that 94 door or the final painting, and I still
yeah.
needed, I think, 5 or 6 jiggies.
Yeah, it's like you need 25 or something to complete the
Yeah,
final painting. And I guess that's how they were trying to gate it is, the farther you got into the game, the more jiggies you required to open up the next level.
yeah.
And so it was that, in that mechanic, they'd hope that if you didn't have enough, you'd go back to previous levels and collect more. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think for me, it's like 100%ing something is usually a separate option than completing a game at this point in time in game design. So in Banjo specifically, it feels like near 100%ing the game is a requirement to actually finishing,
I feel
at
like
least in terms of jiggies and notes.
we must sound spoiled to game developers 20 years ago. We're spoiled by modern games. You can finish 30% of the game and still get to the ending credits. No worries, man. Don't
I
worry
can only
about
imagine them like, oh, my mistake. You don't actually want to play the game then.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
my time is valuable.
How dare you expect me to complete the objectives in this game to complete this game?
It's a backwards way of thinking they had back then.
Well, it's funny because one thing that they did back then that they don't really do anymore is cheat codes. And that is something I did not encounter throughout my whole playthrough until I found out afterwards that that's something that was even possible.
Well, it's weird that they call them cheat codes because it seems like they're really just upgrades. Because I found one which let me carry twice as many feathers, which is basically just like a bigger feather pouch. It
Yeah.
wasn't big heads mode.
I think the whole thing is that it's not required to beat the game. You could absolutely beat the game with the base inventory for red feathers, yellow feathers, and eggs, but it makes it easier once you get those.
Sure.
So I feel like something coming out back in the 90s that really wasn't as generous as games have become in terms of appreciating the player's time, if you could even say that. I think it's a fair challenge overall. I think that requiring the player to have to collect a majority of the actual goal of each level is acceptable. And I think that I think that the notes are a bit more questionable, just based on them resetting anytime you lose your health.
I think it was
I
an
think that.
unnecessary bit of padding.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like a Mario Red Coins from Hell in a way. But I think like this game still came out when they were trying to lengthen these games as much as possible, right? And whether that be through like difficulty curves or however, right? Whatever it means. I think what this one does right is its difficulty lengthener is making you play the actual like the entirety of the game. Which I mean the game is good. Maybe if you don't want to have to try to collect everything, it's a lot better of a way of lengthening a game than putting in, random mini games or side challenges that don't have anything to do with the rest of the game or aren't actually fun.
That's true. There is really only one objective in this game, or one main loop that you're always constantly going through. So it is, and that is, collecting things and looking for things. So it is good that that is really just maintained as the central focus pretty much the whole way through.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that you're right. It focuses on collecting jiggies and music notes, and that's it. But to do that, they do vary the gameplay a lot. There are those mini games still, and
I guess that's true. There are still the mini games, but there's no
yeah,
like, plumbing or random other things like that you have to go
right.
through.
Yeah, there's no giant plumbing in this one.
Like Mumbo doesn't turn you into like a bricklayer all of a sudden, right?
Doesn't
Yeah,
tell you to
you're.
build your own car either.
Yeah.
Too soon.
Oh God, always too soon.
But even still, I I think I just I had a bad time with Bubble Gloop Swamp, but the mini game in that one where you're up against that red crocodile, it's a lot of the mini games are still frustrating, even if the end goal is still the same as you've been doing in every other aspect of the game, where it
Yeah.
requires you to do this new challenge that's mostly separate than everything else you've been doing. And it's the same in the Frizizi Peak, where you have to do the sled racing, and it often doesn't feel very good. It feels like the AI aspect of the your challenger in the situation has some cheats available to them that you don't. And for example, for me in the Bubble Gloop Swamp with the alligator, anytime, and I think you have to eventually realize that you need to keep him in frame and you need to steal the ones he's going for. But there's plenty of times where I was 7, 8 note or 8, whatever they are, little red things above the guy.
Yumblies, I believe.
Yumblies, yes, how could I forget? Um, and it's the last 10 seconds, and I'm like, oh, I've got this. I'm way ahead, and he catches up out of nowhere because he's out of frame and he's just getting one after the other because the game just doesn't want you to win that way.
Yeah. You have to game that guy. You have to like get in his face, eat
Yeah.
his yumblies.
And it feels the same with the sled racing, where there's a lot of rubber banding happening with the polar bear. So you could be ahead or you could be behind even, and he'll slow down in certain parts. So it goes both ways, but it never feels entirely organic. The game is still trying to win or give you a chance in certain points. It's never just you're beating them because you are better. And anyways, aside from that, one other little frustration that I wanted to bring up is that, say in the Monster Mansion, a lot of the exploration relies on your ability to realize that something that appears as a 2D texture is actually interactable and you can break it and go through. And this happens in more than just that level, that world, but
I
I think
assume you're talking about the gates that you need to knock open.
not necessarily the gates, but the windows. The
Ah, okay.
windows that you have to break to get into different rooms. And, you know, given no context, they just look like window textures on a building in an N64 game.
It is some classic old Nintendo. How was I supposed to know that? kind of moments.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, moments where you just don't even know how you're supposed to interact with the elements in the game in order to get to where you're supposed to go,
yeah, yeah.
which is
It's
never what you want.
2D textures or things you didn't realize were interactable or 3D or you could pass through, and I feel like the game does a lot of that. But
I feel like he does an okay job of it. I mean, sure, there's some there, and there's the odd one in Rusty Bucket Bay I can think of. But I feel like for
yeah,
like the vast majority, like the beginning of the game, there's not too much stuff that's in front of you that you have no idea how to interact with. But
yeah,
towards the end of the
those
game,
are
maybe they try to
definitely.
introduce new elements, make things more difficult, and maybe I can understand how you'd feel a little more slighted by it.
Yeah, no, those two worlds are definitely the biggest offenders, I think, in terms of that. But it just doesn't feel good. And for two worlds out of what, maybe one, two, three, maybe 10 max, 10 or so worlds. It's a decent
Yeah,
amount
so
of
there's
them.
10 with like Grunty's Lair, and I think
Okay, yeah.
11 if
So
you count Spiral Mountain.
yeah, so yeah, 10, 11 worlds. Two of those, decent percentage of your gameplay is gonna be revolving around realizing you can interact with something that doesn't look like you could otherwise. So it's something small, but it's something that obviously could have used improvement, at least in my eyes.
I think that's fair.
Though I do want to point out that Rusty Bucket Bay was probably my favorite level.
Really,
Yeah. So
this is surprising.
yeah, so I think the reason being is that I really appreciated the puzzle box design, if you will, if I could channel some GMTK here, and that you have to control these mechanics and propellers, whatever, overall in this level. And yeah, aside from the ship itself, there's some frustrating movement puzzles and whatnot that I've already spoken about being not particularly happy with. But the ship itself, I think, was actually really enjoyable. And I think it was because it relied less on puzzles requiring precise movement and more on understanding what you're affecting and how to pass through certain areas. I mean, I'm not sure what you guys thought was, your favorite particular aspect of the game, but for me, I think that was it, even despite other issues in the level that I had.
I think I like that one. I think other than that, for me, like Treasure Trove Cove just kind of, I don't
Yeah.
like it has a little place in my heart. I just really love that mission, or that
Yeah.
level rather.
Right
And then
off the
obviously,
bat.
yeah, it's like it's right at the beginning. It's like fun. It's fairly simple for the most part. It just has so much personality too. Also, I think Click Clock Wood just because it's like a really cool level. It's got to be
Yeah.
up there for me
Wood
as
is
well.
a masterpiece.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a
The
good ass
seasons
level.
are absolutely charming and pretty
Yeah,
beautiful considering
it's
what they
really
could achieve back
creative,
then.
really clever.
Yeah, no, there was definitely a lot of good in this game.
Hmm.
And despite how much I've complained, I will say that I do like the game.
Hey, that's a
There
good
we
review
go.
from Evan.
Saved. It's a piece of shit, but it's also not.
Yeah.
Once you
No,
get
yeah, I
over
would
being
agree.
a
This
piece
is
of shit,
definitely, yeah. I mean, it's definitely. I think, yeah, it's a good game. It has a lot of spirit to it. But before we kind of close out, I guess let's go over some questions. Let's go over some big hot questions here. So, famously, there never was a Banjo 3 properly. There was Nuts and Bolts, and then more recently, Ukulele. But how likely is it that we ever actually get a proper Banjo 3?
oof. Probably not ever at this
Basically,
point.
oof.
It's going to be
Yeah.
an oof out of 10.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, I don't know. Banderson Smash, guys. Anything's possible.
It's true.
I think that's actually a good point. I think that the reason it's been such a hot topic among Banjo fans is that once Microsoft acquired Banjo or Rare, sorry, I think that people had high hopes, and then those hopes were not met, and then they just basically have not been doing much of anything since then.
Well, I think they
But
worked on Sea of Thieves, which came out recently. Isn't that
Did
Isn't
they?
that supposed to be good?
I
Yeah,
do
that
believe,
looks
yeah,
like
I
a
think that's
fairly
the right
good one.
title.
Yeah. Yeah.
Again, it's
Yeah.
definitely a departure of from where they started, and definitely where they have been for the past 10 years, making like sports adventure games for the Microsoft Kinect. But I mean,
Yeah,
it's
but it
it, it
shows
is a
there's still
bit of a
talent
return to
there.
form.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I don't have this like well researched or anything really, but I have to imagine that most of the original people who worked on Banjo 1 and 2 are no
No,
longer with Rare. So,
absolutely. I feel like
and
they
quite a
definitely
few of
moved on by
them,
now.
quite a few of them worked on the recent ukulele, which, depending on who you
Hot
ask, was
topic in
not.
and of itself. Yeah.
Yeah, it
definitely
was
for
not
sure.
the game people wanted it to be.
Well, it's a very difficult kind of game to make now, right? I mean, it's so much beauty and simplicity that like, is this really going to grab people's attention? I mean, and there's so many little things that a lot of the charm is added to the fact that it came out in that era.
Yeah, I think something that a lot of people who wish we had more of Banjo nowadays forget is that platformers aren't, back then it was using a lot of what was available to the developer in terms of gameplay and making interesting interactions out of that. But, these days there's almost infinite things that a developer could do to create interesting gameplay and gameplay loops. And platforming is a fairly simplistic mechanic in terms of complexity now. It's not something that really pushes the envelope in terms of design these days. And
Yeah.
I
We
think
want to be
because
able to
that
design complicated things like cars.
oh no.
Yeah.
But I think because of that, platforming has sort of fallen away from the mainstream appeal since it
Well,
Yeah.
had in the
not
past.
even just that. I also think it's similar to the reason why we haven't seen a Half-Life 3, right? It's like, well, what would we really do to innovate or change or
I
to
mean, they
make this
got
game amazing?
Half-Life Alex now, right?
Yeah, that's definitely something. I mean, that's definitely, and that's again a big experiment into VR controls and things like that. Like, it's definitely a huge step forward. It's like
Yeah.
if they were just to put out Banjo 3 and it's kind of the same but different as Banjo and Banjo
Uh-huh.
Tooie. I mean,
Uh-huh.
even going forward to Banjo Tooie, like they made a ton of changes, but I mean, a lot of them weren't necessarily for the better. Adding more to the formula doesn't always make it a better game.
You're right. Absolutely. I think it can just complicate a very uh, simple and elegant idea and make it messy. I think for me, at least, as someone who, was not a fan when this came out, and, I haven't had any experience with the game and not even much with the genre up until now. I feel like if they were going to try to do a modern interpretation, it would have to focus much more on the exploration than the platforming to get that same feel out of the game in sort of, modern game design.
I think that's probably right. But let me offer a follow up then. Should they make a Banjo 3 at this point?
I don't want to see it ruined. I really like this game. I I mean, I'm really open to it, and obviously the problem with anything that you're nostalgic about is, you know, you wanting it to be the same thing and having the same sort of experience and feelings. But that's not what a sequel is supposed to be. That's not what a good sequel is supposed to be.
Well, it wouldn't even be satisfying at all.
Yeah, I feel like that's what ukulele tried to be. It tried to be exactly what banjo used to be.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem is like off the top of my head, maybe a nostalgia cash in would seem appealing, but I don't think that would actually turn into a good game.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's trying to cash in on a very small group of players who really enjoyed something and don't want it to change. But I think in the bigger picture, most people want evolution out of long-standing IPs
Hmm.
in some way or other.
Well, more in the realm of possibility then. Do you think that we'll ever get like a Banjo Kazooie remastered, like they made the Crash Bandicoot recently and the Spyro?
I think it's possible. I think that, you know,
Honestly,
especially
I'm
in the up
surprised it hasn't happened yet.
yeah. Well, I think in the upcoming generation being the Xbox Series X, that they're going to be wanting anything to get players wanting to be on the platform. I think that they might cash in this generation and just do
Banjo, you're our only hope. We
it.
must save the Xbox.
Yeah, I think that it's something they could do to get some sales, but I also think that it's something that developers probably don't want to do. You know, it's not very creative. You're just recreating what you've done before or what someone else has done before. You
Hmm.
know, it's not fun, most likely, in terms of creation and development.
Well,
So I
especially
can
a
It
game
can
with
be.
so much personality like that. I mean, you can't really even add your own spark to it.
yeah. So I could feel like a publisher wants it to happen, but not necessarily the developers. So I think it's a possibility that it happens in the next few years or, 7 years maybe, but I can't imagine that it would be something, groundbreaking. I don't imagine it's going to be
Oh,
something that,
certainly not.
yeah.
I mean,
But
this is really
I think,
more just a point to how successful the kind of the Crash Bandicoot, the Spyro remasters have been, and people really fawned over those quite a lot, just
that's
because
true.
of the nostalgia cash in.
Yeah, and I think the remaster gives a good opportunity for new generations to appreciate older uh, games and IPs.
And hopefully the controls will be better.
Yeah. Yeah, the Banjo-Kazooie remaster requires N64 controller and adapter to play.
Yeah, new peripheral.
Yeah,
It's a good idea.
part of the
Cool.
experience.
All right. Well, one final kind of wrap up question here: does this game hold up in 2020 to modern games? It's still worth playing.
I think this kind of comes down to the same thing we always say about a lot of these old games is controls, maybe not so much. Everything else, hell yeah. Still a super enjoyable experience if you just want to talk about the rest of it.
Yeah,
Well, I'll
I
say
have,
that even playing it on N64 myself, just a couple weeks ago, it was quite enjoyable. I mean, the controls we've said this and that, but it wasn't enough for me to say this is not worth my time. It was still very charming and fun.
I have to agree. This is my first time playing the game, uh, and like I said right at the beginning, 5-10 minutes in, I was enjoying myself. And despite everything I've said, by the end of my experience, I'd still say it was a fun game with really, really funny moments and really unique and quirky stuff going on. And in terms of gameplay, maybe not as deep as something that could come out today, but for the time you can put into it, I think it's very enjoyable.
Yeah. I'd be very much interested to see what you guys have to say after playing the Xbox port of it. Because it really does
Yeah.
solve a lot of those kind of nagging, well, literally the controls, a little bit of the camera, and a bunch of, you don't lose all your music notes when you die. So it
Conversely, I'd be
might,
curious how you'd see the N64 version with the hard mode difficulty
the
Master
hard
turned
mode.
Quest.
on.
Bring it on. No, I definitely think the Xbox is a superior way to play it at this point, but
Yeah.
don't tell the purists I said that.
Well, Cam, do you want to give your kind of final thoughts?
Sure. I mean, man, there is just so much legacy surrounding this game. There's amazing interviews with some of the developers. The sound designer Grant Kirkhope has some amazing talks about his process designing the sound and everything. It really, when you get down in the nitty gritty and kind of the stories of what went into making this game, it even gives you even more an appreciation of what you can extract from it just from surface level. It really, truly is one of my favorite games, even to this day.
I agree. It's a very special game just through its uniqueness and charm. And I think if you haven't experienced it already, it's worth it, despite the age and despite the frustration that you will likely experience throughout it. It is still a very overall enjoyable and fun experience with a lot of heart behind it.
I mean, I think it's like $8 on Xbox. Just go play it on Xbox.
Yeah, don't get in on
Yeah.
N64. That stuff's still like $50.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I can really say much more other than I'm actually quite impressed with the level of polish that's in this game. I mean, for a 20-year-old game on N64, I didn't come across any breaking bugs or crashes or freezes, which definitely happens on N64 games quite a lot. So it's a surprisingly robust bit of technology. But yeah, it's definitely a good game. It's interesting. It's unique. It's charming. All the things we've said. And if we ever do get this modern remake or even a new one, I'm sure it would sell like hotcakes, regardless of how good it is. But that's going to be it for this episode. You guys can join us on the next episode where we're going to be discussing the first Call of Duty Black Ops. Hey folks, this is Perry. Thanks for listening to GameDive. Make sure to join in on the discussion below and let us know your thoughts on the game, and if you enjoyed the episode, be sure to leave us a like. GameDive is a monthly podcast, so if you want to hear more from us, you can subscribe or follow to get updated when our next episode airs. See you next time.